Hello and welcome everyone. I hope you are doing better than good today. This channel is my Delphi enthusiast channel, and for those who are interested to learn Delphi programming, specifically on Object Pascal. The tools that I'm using in my training are Embarcadero Community Edition, MySQL Database, SQL Yog, and the DevArt MySQL Data Access Components. Honestly, I cannot afford any of these tools, but my development platform is still with Delphi 7, a pretty old version of Delphi. Only in these tutorials that I'm using the recent versions of Delphi and together with the other tools, since I cannot afford them. Hopefully, someone will donate to me a licensed version in any of these tools someday. So, let's get started. Today we'll build a Delphi Windows application using a simple implementation of CRUD, or create, update, and delete, including a search as well. And we are going to utilize the Northwind MySQL database. For the MySQL database, you can always search this one in Google. I think the first result gives you the MySQL equivalent of the Northwind database. Okay, before we start, I just have a few reminders. For this case, we will only implement one entity for our addition, creation, deletion, updating, and searching of records. And we are going to focus on the employee table because I think this is more familiar to us. And the challenge here is that you can replicate such project for other entities like suppliers, products, whatever major entities that will be involved in the Northwind database. All right, one of the first things that we have to consider every time we build a desktop or a database application is actually the table design. So like any other development, we have to understand the data that is involved during the development or even before development. So basically building the database is very much part of the planning stage. But in this case, we already have created, or the Northwind database is already existent, everything is there, we actually have temporary data, then this is actually good because the database design is already there as well. So this is why I'm utilizing the Northwind database. But we have to be familiar what are the different fields in the employee table for the Northwind database. As you can see here, there are several fields that are involved in the field, but we will only focus to or maybe around 5 fields. And in this case also, I cannot include all so that I could shorten the video. You can replicate the other fields on your own. Anyway, the process is pretty much the same. Okay, so in this case, this is basically our simple application that we're going to build. So as you can see here, the data coming here is from the Northwind database. So we display first the list of the employees, and then we have an add option. We create an add form. I did not include all the fields to make this video much shorter. Anyway, the implementation is pretty much the same. We can select a record and then perform an update to that one. And we can also select a record and perform a deletion of that particular record. And of course, we can also search a particular record as well and then select, and it's up to you if you want to update or if you want to delete such record. Okay, so let's get started. Alright, here we are now with our new VCL application. So you click on File, New, and Windows VCL application, and you should have this form as your starting form. Now, based on my practice, I always make sure that I save the files at the very beginning and name them accordingly. So in this case, I'm going to save the project first. So I'll just create a folder for this one. This is intended for, let's say, employees. So let's just say the first unit, the unit 1 would be our main form. So let's say this is the employee list form, and then the project would be just the employee list. And then in this case, we are going to add a grid. Actually, I would really prefer to have panels first because this is just to give you an idea also of to better illustrate on using panels as well. So it makes things much easier for you later on, especially on terms of design. So I want to design my form in a much simpler way. This panel would be located at the bottom part. This is intended for the buttons, the add, edit, delete buttons, and this one is for the grid. This occupies the upper portion of the form, and then I can just rename the form as employee list. Employee list. And then one of the things that I always take note is the naming convention of my forms. So in this case, I will just do some kind of a reverse and use the naming convention of form names. So for forms, I shorten it to FRM, and then employee list. In that way, I can easily recall what this form is for, and if I look at the file, I will also know what are the contents of that particular form. Next up is, let's add a DB grid. In this case, I will occupy the entire screen for this grid, and then let's add some buttons. I have here, let's just simplify it. Create, and then you can always align this one later on. So update, and then delete. Oh, before I forgot, I think I missed another form. Let's just check. We need to have some kind of a search form at the very top as well. So let me take into consideration that one. So let me add one more panel here at the top, because I want to have a search area just to give us more control of our layout. I prefer this kind of setup. So create, update, then delete, and then we'll just have this close, just to close the form. So let me just drag this one on the side and arrange it accordingly. I think that is good enough. And then let's add an edit here, and then a label, search. So always take into consideration the naming convention of every component or object that you have added to the form. It really makes things much simpler or much easier as well. So of course you have to have the button for the search. So you can actually do that one. Sometimes you can just type go, I should say. It's up to you really, if you whatever name that you want to utilize for that one. Now, so the search, let me rename this one to, since this is an edit, I will just use search keyword. This one would be button search. This one would be button create. I'm just naming this one so that it could be much easier for me later on to work with the different buttons. And then btn close. So for close, obviously I can just type close there, so to close the form. And then I think this is a good start for us. So aside from this form, we need to add another form. For the DB grid, that's good enough. We can utilize the name for that one. It's up to you if you want to rename it as well. So aside from that one, we can also add another form for the one that we're going to use for adding and updating a record. So in this case, we are going to reuse the same form in terms of how we're going to create a new record or update a new record. Okay, so let me just let me prepare the form so that it would be made much faster for you. Alright, I have prepared the employee details form. I made it just very simple so that it would not be difficult or for you to follow as well. So just create a new form here, VCL form. Sorry for that, new VCL form, and then you should be able to have this one. Now the same process that I utilize, I added a panel first, as you can see here. The panel first at the top, and then the panel at the bottom. You can always come up with your own design for this one, because this is just very traditional for me. I've been used to this kind of very simple design because I want to make things work as much as possible. Normally the design for me would come in later, but of course you can always have the option to beautify, I should say, it a little bit later. All right, so you add 4 labels. So basically the labels, you don't have to rename them, but the edit boxes is very much important to be renamed accordingly so that you will not have difficulty in remembering them. So you can have employee ID, so it's in there, first name, last name, and email. The naming conventions, it's really up to you. If you want to shorten it, it's up to you. If not, then it's up to you as well. The button save, and then the button cancel. Now, I always also consider the position of the form upon loading. So the way to do that one, to customize the position, if you can see here at the very bottom, there's a small window here. That's actually the form screen position when your actual executable file is already run. But for me to be able to position the form consistently, I would like to position it here. So there's a property here called position. So this form will always open right after the main form. So yeah, so it will always open at the very center of the form. You can also position it every time the form is loaded at the very center of the desktop. It's up to you. You have several options here as well. And then after that, don't forget to save. So the same naming convention I utilize. So in this case, I just use employee details form, and then the name of the form would be FRM employee details. This is just my own naming convention, but if you have your own, it's really up to you. All right, let's get started. So this form will be utilized for updating and creating new records. Okay, and then let me just go back to our list form. So in this case, when we are dealing with databases, we always make sure that our application communicates with our database server. So in this case, I may have forgot to mention that the MySQL application that the MySQL database that I'm using is the one coming from the WAMP server, because I prefer WAMP server because the development stack for this one is much easier for me to manage, and I do not have also much issues with it. So for testing purposes only, but of course for production purposes, you must have a separate installation of your database. Now, I'm going to add, in order for us to communicate with our database, I'm going to add a data module. So file, new, other unit. There's a database there. You select that one, and then there should be a data module. Under the data module, this is basically a container of your data access components. You have your connection and your data sets as well. So normally I would rename this one to just DM to simplify it in my code, and then just save it as a data module to make it much easier. So I'll be using the MyDoc data access components from DevArt. Unfortunately, what I have is only a trial edition or trial version. So if you are kind enough, you might want to sponsor an individual license for me. I would be more than happy to accept that one. Anyway, yeah, I'm just going to rename this one. So this is our primary connection to our database. So normally we just have to configure it at the very start so that to see if our MySQL database is also working. So the default username for MySQL is root. For WAMP server installations, if you do not set any passwords, normally it is just blank, so you can leave this password as blank here. Your login prompt, please set that to false, and then you may have to opt the database selection later on, and you can select, but you can select it at the very stage. because as you can see here, it's already active. You can already select this one. So you can select Northwind, and then yep, the moment that it is connected to true, if you you can always do that one for you to test. I mean, so you have to set this to true. So if everything is okay, no errors, then your data module or your data access to the MySQL database is now good to go. Okay. Now the next thing that you have to add is what we call the data set. So under our MyDoc, we have MyQuery, MyTable, and several other options there. I'll be using the MyQuery. This is what we call data set. So this is the one that actually communicates the carrier of the commands to and from the database server, between your application and the database server. So let me just set this one, the connection to con. So basically it is connected to the connection because it basically utilizes a passage to the database using the connection. So I'm going to rename this one first to just QRY select. Just want to utilize a naming convention that is really much easier for me to recall. So when I do a query select, I normally use this data set for selection queries only. Nothing else, just selection. Okay, so once we have that set, if you notice, of course, we will do the active part and the SQL setting in a while. Let me go back first to the employee list form, so you now have the DB grid. Now the DB grid will will need some kind of a data source. So in this case, we are going to add a data source. Let me see. I think we have a data source also coming from MyDoc, so we can add the same in here. So I just added this to the form because the data source is normally specific to the grid. Of course, this can be used also across, but this one I want to dedicate this particular grid to just one data source. So yes, let me just rename. No problem with the renaming since this is only one, but we set the data source of the DB grid to my data source. Okay, so basically what's going to happen is that in the Delphi development platform, when you are dealing with databases, your grid connects to a data source. Your data source is connected to a data set, and of course your data set is connected to your connection. So that's actually the link. There are 4 of them, but if everything of all of those is connected, everything life is much easier. All right, so when you select the data source, there's an option there for the data set. So we are going to add the data set, the one that we had created earlier from the data module, which is the QRY select. Unfortunately, we cannot see it yet because we have not linked the data module to the employee list form. So what we will do is that we are going to use the unit data module so that they are going to see each other. So go to File, Use Unit, and then I'll select the data module here. After that, I go back to my data source. I should be seeing the data set this time. There you are. So DM, which refers to the data module dot the corresponding data set data QRY select. Okay, so right now we don't have any data because we have not placed any SQL statement in our QRY select, but for illustration purposes, I'm going to illustrate to you adding an SQL command here directly in the data set. So remember, we want to display all the employees. So let me try this one. Select asterisk from employees, and then what you will do, as long as the connection is okay, you check connection is true, all you have to do is just activate the data set. Once you set this to true, just double click on it. You should already see the list of employees in the employee form. Just as easy as that one. Alright, so yeah, so this is basically how easy it is to develop a simple application in Delphi. But we are not going to utilize this kind of setup because we are going to place it in a code to make it more dynamic. All right. All right, this time let me go back to our employee list form. So at this stage, we're going to display the data from the employee table in a more dynamic way. So I have to remove the SQL statement coming from the SQL select. So we are going to set this one uh, directly in the code. So yes, that's what we're going to do. And let's say, for example, so as you can see, we have the form, and the form has several events that we could utilize off. So one way to do this one would be using the onShow event. So during this stage, we have what we call the we try to populate the grid by providing the data set with an SQL statement, and it triggers only when the form is shown. So let me try to do that one. So that is one way to shorten your what do you call this, templates. So Delphi Community Edition takes advantage of a lot of shortcuts. So right at this point, so every time we reuse the data set, in this case, I'll be reusing the QRY select several times. So what I'm trying to do here is that I set it first to false. Then I clear any existing SQL statements that is being passed, and then I can assign a new SQL statement using SQL.text equals my corresponding SQL statement. You can also use SQL.add in this case, if whatever you prefer. And then we activate it again and set it to true. So what we're trying to populate is actually the employees, right? So we just provide here the employees, and basically this is what will be sent to the database server, and the database server will return the list of employees through the QRY select dataset. Now, since the dataset is connected to the data source, and the data source is connected to the grid, then that's the time it will display the list of employees in the form. So when we run this one, it will display the same way as this we have shown to you earlier. All right, so we now have the employee list. Now we'll try to improve the DB grid, because right now the DB grid is not very much well, I should say it's very vulnerable to changes in the grid. So we don't want that one to happen. So let me close this one and go back to the grid. So in the grid properties, there's options in there, and we just have to enable row select so that we cannot select the cells individually, and automatically the editing option will be set to false. So in that way, we can actually change it directly to this one. So yeah, so the row is being selected. So we'll try to improve also the grid interface later, the column headers and the width size for each column. So we'll try to improve that one. Moving forward, we are going to proceed with our insertion of records. So we're going to create a new record. So what happens now is that when we click on create, the employee details form comes out, and we supply the fields with the information needed on the employee. However, we have to make sure that the employee details knows that we are adding a record, right? Because we are trying to utilize the same form when we are updating a record. Basically, because we are just talking of the same fields, except for the employee ID, which we cannot modify, because based on the data database design, the employee ID is actually an auto number. All right. So in the employee list form, when I double click on create, I have already added some codes here. I'll just explain it to you so that we will be much faster. So what I have done here is a very simple approach. So what I did is that I set a caption to the employee details form, employee details -add, and then before the form is being displayed. In that way, the caption of the details form is updated. And now when we have the form, once the form shows, remember when we are trying to update a record, if we are trying to insert a new record, all we have to do is basically clear all fields and there are no existing values from the previous usage of that form is existent in there. So all we have to do is probably to be sure is we clear them. Now, since we are going to use this form for insertion and updating, we have to let the employee details form what we're trying to do. Now, when the form displays, what happens is that I want to clear the edit boxes first. So on the onForm show event, if the self that caption, so this refers to the employee details form, the self, the caption is equal to the employee details dash add, then we clear the fields. That's the idea. We just basically clear them, and then once it clears, the user supplies the values, the fields, and then save the record. So we do not have to supply, when we are adding a record here, we do not have to supply an employee ID because in our database, the employee ID is actually an auto-generated value. Now when the user clicks on save, we check again whether we are inserting a record or updating a record. In that way, we would be able to determine if we are trying to update or insert a new record. So we just have to verify some of the fields that are required. In this case, I have checked for the employee first name and the last name to be sure that they are actually, what do you call this? They should not be blank. Actually, they should be and, not or, so that both of them must be required. So we go to the part where we insert the SQL command. So in this case, I am using now the dataset QRY insert. Before I forget, I already have added additional datasets in my data module for every SQL command that I wanted to issue. So I have added additional for QRY insert, QRY update, and QRY delete. So these datasets will be reused for any SQL command for insertion, updating, or deletion. So basically that's the idea. Now, the same process is going to be happen when we were trying to display the when we issue the SQL command for selecting records, but this time our insertion of the SQL command would be the insert SQL or SQL insert. So insert into employees the fields that we want to be at what we want to add, corresponding values. So if these are string values, please make sure that you have included the coded str there. And then we have to separate the fields, or the values, with a comma as well. So you can follow this along. Now, to be sure that you're having the right statement, you can prior to execution of the SQL statement, you can show the message, or you can show the SQL text, the full SQL command that you're trying to insert. So just to show you what is being sent to the database server. After that, it executes. If everything goes well, it will display a message, new record successfully added. All right, let's give it a shot. So I run it. So in here, we have the last record here, ID 615. Let's create. So let me do John McLean. I believe you know this one. a@a.com, just for a test. So this is what happens when you have the show message SQL.text. So it displays the actual SQL statement that will be sent. This will also help you in debugging purposes later on. So you can follow that if you want to. All right, we have a new record successfully added. All right, we have here already a new record. So if you notice here, it refreshed the grid, okay, but it skipped already the 16 ID. But don't worry, I have an earlier record earlier, which was the ID of 16, so it skipped that one already. So yeah, that works fine. So as you notice here, you can disable or you can comment this one if you are already okay with how the insertion is working. So that's for the insertion. So that is really, I hope you were able to understand. If ever you missed something, just don't worry. You can write your questions in the comment section. Okay, so let's proceed to the next module, updating. I may have forgotten earlier during the creation. You may have noticed the refresh grid procedure here that I called. As you notice, every time we display a form and we insert a record, we want our grid to update also the list as it is shown here and reflecting the newly added record in the list, right? So right after I called on the show model, it should go back to the list form. And of course, we have to perform some way to refresh the list. In this way, instead of creating the query or adding the query there, like the entire command here, because we can basically do this one here. Instead of having that one, we can always place that there so that the list would actually be refreshed. But instead of doing this one, what I did is that I created a procedure for the called refresh grid and placed this query here. And then what I did is just call the refresh grid procedure so that it will just reuse the code. So as simple as that one. So the next part is updating. So in updating records, what happens is that we select a record here and then we click update. So we have to know the record that is being selected before we can perform an update. Now in the update section, when I click on this one, the same process will happen. I set the caption to employee details does update, and then I need to capture the value or the ID that was being selected in the grid. So in order for me to get that one, there are several ways to do this. What I did here is just using the simplest approach that I could get is that I call on the DB grid, and as you notice, there are several fields shown here in the grid, especially when you run it. Then the first column normally that is shown is the ID, and the index of that ID would be 0. So that's why it has here the field 0, that text. So what this captures is actually the selected ID of that particular record, and then assign it to a temporary place or a variable. I'm just using the hint property here of the employee details form. The hint property is something that could be used for something else, but I'm just reusing it for the meantime so that I do not have to declare any variables at all. And like I said, there are so many ways to do this one. You can also use the tag property. It's really up to you. Then I call on the employee details, the show model. So now we display the form. Now on the form show event, I have added here the else if, so that we would be able to determine that, rather inform the details form that we are now performing an update. So what happens is that in this case, I have also added a new data set, select details. So you might see it here. For the reason I'm selecting this one is that, remember, I have used the QRY select in the grid, right? Now, if I'm going to use the QRY select in the details form as well, what happens is that my list here will get lost or will be removed because I'll be reusing QRY select and issue a different command. So instead of doing that one, I simply added a new data set and use it for selection of that specific employee, all the details rather of that specific employee. So I query again and then capture the value, select asterisk from employees where ID is equal to self.hint, and then yes, activate it, and then you populate the values in the edit boxes. So basically this is what happens. So employee ID is equal to dm.qri select details, that field by name.id. So by the way, the ID number cannot be updated or cannot be modified. So you might want to set this one to read only to true. And you might want to change the color of this one to something else, probably a little bit lighter than that one. Just any color perhaps. Because sometimes the user might get confused. So just to indicate that this is something that cannot be modified. Alright, so once it is populated, we select the ID, we populate the values in the fields, and then we save. The same process, we save, but this time we issue the command. Let me use the and here because I want to make sure there are two fields that are required, and they must not be left blank. And then I am using now the dataset QRY update, and then this time I issued the update SQL update command. So be sure to be familiar with your SQL commands. So the same process, I perform show message just to let me see what was my SQL command that was sent to the database server, and exec SQL instead of active equals true. Okay, so yes, this is what you're going to use. And then after that, record successfully updated, we might want to add the close right after. So let's give it a shot. So let's try to update John McClain here. John McClain, so let's say John Michael McClain, save. Yes, do not forget the where, because this is really very important your what do you call this, conditions, because otherwise everything in your data will be updated if you miss the where. Okay, so there you go, and the update has been performed. So it's really very easy on this one. So you can follow along on this code. So hopefully you get that one right. So we proceed now to deletion of records. So in the delete option or the delete functionality, we do not have to reuse the details form, but it's actually an option for you. But you'll if you want to display all the details of that particular record, you might probably want to change this caption of this one to delete instead of save. So you can probably modify that in one of your during form show if you're trying to do the deletion. But in this case, what happens with the delete is that it's just a simple function. I select a record, click the delete button, and then just prompt the user a yes or no if he wants to delete it or not. Yes or no. If it selects yes, deletes the record, refresh the grid, and then yeah, basically that's it. All right. So again, we don't have much of a reuse of the details form here. So when I click on the delete, the same process is going to be selected. It's similar to the update option, wherein we have to select first the record before we can delete that record. So I check here the selected record if it is not a blank. So we are after of the ID of that particular record because that's the most unique field that we have. That's basically the primary key in the employee table, right? So in that case, we cannot have it blank. So if it is going to be blank, then we just prompt the user that there is no record selected. And if there's already an existing value for this selection, then we prompt the user, are you sure you want to delete this record? You can use this command, message dialog, and then you have several options here, confirmation, warning, and you can look it up online. And then similar command can be issued. This time your SQL delete will be the one that you are going to issue. So don't forget the where option, because that is your condition for the deletion. So just match it to the value of your ID number. Now take note, the ID number here is an integer value. So once a value is an integer, this particular .text, that should be enough already. We do not have to place the coded str. You only add the coded str if the particular if the data type of that field is actually a character or a string. Okay, then execute SQL. We perform the we refresh the grid after the deletion. So let's give it a try. So we'll try to delete this one. Delete record. Yes. Record successfully deleted. Okay. So basically the grid is now refreshed, and you notice there that particular record is already removed. Very easy, right? Okay, so the next part I'm going to explain, I think I have not explained a little bit deeper on the search option. So what I did is that I'm trying to reuse the, what do you call this? The refresh grid here. So when the form, if you notice, when the form is loaded, we display the value. We display the records by calling this command, right? Now, remember this particular block of statements, we have created this one already under the refresh grid. Is it possible that we can just call refresh grid instead of having this code? Definitely yes. So that's what I'm going to do. Refresh grid. It calls that particular query. In this case, that particular query actually based on whatever value that is inside the search keyword here. Okay, so for example, this particular search option is not really the best way because what I'm trying to do here is that every time, or we can just simply click on go instead of doing that one. So when we click on go, we can also call on the refresh grid, and then the refresh grid execute this query. This query then will look for a record wherein the last name is actually like, okay, not equal, but something similar to what you have been typing. All right, so let's give it a try. So in this case, the last name that we are looking here would be Kotas. Let's just use the first three letters, and it brings us the corresponding value. So click go again, remove, and then that's what happens. Now, what if you want to type every letter you type is already gives you the result? This is not really recommended if you have a lot of records, but for now I'm going to illustrate it to you. Just make sure you make some tweaking, like for example, it will search only maybe at least 3 letters before it calls the refresh grid command. So basically you can do that one here, refresh grid, just like that. So every time you type a letter, it matches or look for a match for that particular letter. Let's say a letter Z. There you are. I just type one letter without typing or without clicking the go. So let's say, for example, we are looking for McLean. That's it. So yeah, that is on change. Basically, in the on change event, anything that you type in the edit box, this particular event is being called. So that's why every time we type on the search keyword box, it calls on the refresh grid and matches, sends a query every time you type a letter. So basically that's the idea of this particular tutorial. Hopefully you are able to understand this tutorial, and I hope I can do some more. Once again, thank you for watching and thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe, share. It's up to you if you want to click on the notification bell, but if you want to gain more, you can also email me. You have my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn, and you can also comment below for any questions or suggestions for my future tutorials. Hopefully I could do more, and let's do better than Kid.